And we're live, apparently. Hello, guys. I am joined today with a medical doctor called Johannes. Say hi, Johannes.
Hello, I'm
Hey.
here.
Yeah, so we've known each other for quite a while, and Johannes figured that it'd be a good idea to do a stream about the coronavirus and some of the details that need to be known by people since it's kind of taken over our society, hasn't it?
Yeah, it's become the popular topic of discussion, so to speak, and there are a lot of kind of misconceptions out there about it and what it does and how is it treated and how do you prevent it.
Okay, yeah. So just before we get started, you guys that are watching, could you let us know if you can hear the both of us just fine? Because I don't want to ask questions and then answers not be received, because that would be frustrating for everyone involved. Okay, so I know that Mongoose Man
Can you
is.
hear us both?
Yeah, Mongoose has said hello, so I think that. I know the stream is live, it's just going to be here. Okay, they're thanking me. No problem. But I'm more interested in whether you lads can hear Johannes. Okay.
You're more interested in what?
I'm more interested if they can
Yeah.
hear you, because I don't know much about this beyond what I've seen from, Dr. John Campbell and stuff on YouTube. Okay, so we can hear you. So, how about for the audience that's here, explain exactly what this threat we're dealing with is.
So the coronavirus, or the current iteration of it. So the name of the virus is called SARS-CoV-2.
Hmm.
Um, that's the name of the virus. It's SARS-CoV-2. It produces a disease called COVID-19. So when you hear the name COVID-19, that's actually the name of the disease, not the virus. And essentially, this virus, it's a member of a large family of viruses called coronaviruses. These viruses are all derived from bats, and they use bats as a vector to infect animals that then spread the disease to humans, and then they become endemic in humans. So most coronaviruses actually are fairly, the most common ones are not very dangerous. They typically cause the common cold. About 20% of the common colds are due to a coronavirus, and they just produce upper respiratory symptoms, and they're fairly benign. There are a couple of coronaviruses, however, that have been a bit more dangerous. So the SARS virus, also known as SARS-CoV-1, that was in 2003, I believe, and that produced a much more dangerous coronavirus that had a 10% mortality. And there's also another coronavirus called MERS, which is still endemic in the Middle East. And it started, I believe, in 2016, I believe. And this one, it infected humans by camels. And so it's still present there. It infects probably about one or two people every week. And that has about a 35% mortality rate.
Phew.
This current iteration, yes, it has a fairly high mortality rate. And it infects people apparently. It only infects people in Saudi Arabia and people who are in close proximity to camels. So if you avoid the camels, I think you're safe for the most part. There is some human to human transmission, but it's not very common. This novel coronavirus that we have, the SARS-CoV-2, it initially, again, likely came from a bat. We have a coronavirus in bats that's about at 99% similar to the current coronavirus in bats, but actually, it's unlikely that it spread directly from bats to humans. It's more likely that it had a second vector. We don't know quite what that vector is. Although I do like the theory that they did find a coronavirus that's 99% similar in penguins. And I like
Hmm.
the theory that penguins spread it to humans somehow through. There's a theory that there was some trafficking of penguins up through Malaysia into China that spread the coronavirus that way.
So
Um,
it's not bat soup,
so the
it's
corona,
penguin,
yes, through the
potentially.
penguins. So, but anyways, the virus then spread to Wuhan, the city of Wuhan, and Hubei, China, I believe,
Yeah.
and that spread in September. And nobody was really notified about the virus until about January of this year, I believe. and that's when it started to go spread throughout the world via travel. There's been some criticism of the Chinese response to this because they're kind of wondering if they knew about the virus earlier, but were trying to go hold back on spreading news about the virus because they didn't want to go inform other people that this virus was present in China.
Yeah,
Currently, as far as oh, go ahead.
yeah. I was just gonna say, I recall seeing signs in front of the military colleges in China that closed because of either this virus or another one on the 2nd of January. So they might well have, as far as I understand.
Yeah, and so they had a very so basically to kind of define more what this virus is. The reason why it's called a coronavirus is because it has these S spikes on the cell membrane that kind of makes it look like it has a crown, and that's why it's called corona from the word
Oh
Latin
yeah.
word for crown. And it uses these spikes essentially to go infect humans via the ACE2 receptor, and that is essentially that's the pathophysiology of it. It typically infects the lower respiratory tract and the upper respiratory tract, and it causes ARDS type picture, which stands for acute respiratory distress, which is essentially a bad viral pneumonia that can cause significant disease. As far as the danger of the virus, about 80% of cases are benign or low grade or asymptomatic. 20% require medical attention of uh, of some sort. Actually, I believe that 20% are hospitalized, and about 5% it looks like have to go to the intensive care unit and require critical care. The mortality appears to be somewhere, depending upon what source you look at, between 1% and 3%. And it's typically ameliorated by our medical system because we're able to go give supportive care while in the hospital.
Okay, so bearing all of this in mind, also if you guys want to submit questions, please do put them in the live chat. I know there are a number of you watching who have questions. I've already seen a couple, and we will answer them shortly. So, bearing this in mind, uh, how could you compare this disease? Could we compare this disease to anything either in living memory or that we could flick through a book and read about?
Yeah, I would go. I would think that the actual danger of this virus is comparable to the Spanish flu. It's a bit more, it's likely a bit more dangerous than the Spanish flu, just given, and it has a fairly similar mortality rate. Again, it's kind of hard to say, but we have much more supportive care nowadays. If you have difficulty breathing, we can go intubate you and go give you, you know, respiratory care, and that's something that we couldn't back in the days of the Spanish flu. And so that's going to reduce the mortality a bit. And again, we have a better understanding of how viruses impact humans, and that largely is again something that we have in our favor that will reduce the mortality rate. But I would go compared to that. As far as the hysteria, honestly, the hysteria nowadays, it's fairly unprecedented. I didn't, granted, I didn't live through the HIV epidemic. I didn't live through much of the other epidemics, but it's beyond that anything that I've seen.
Okay, yeah. Just to answer a question, Japhets asked, "Who's Doctor Johannes?" So you're a medical doctor, right?
Yeah, I'm a medical doctor. I live and work in the Midwest of the United States, so we don't have too many cases here as of yet. Granted, the U.S. response as far as testing has been rather slow. Part of that's just because I'm not quite sure the sensitivity and specificity of the tests that they do in other countries, and that's one big issue is that, the sensitivity of the test is how sensitive is it at picking up a virus, and the specificity is, okay, if you test positive on the test, how likely is it that you actually have the virus? And given that I don't quite know those parameters of the various tests that they use here in the United States or in other countries, it's a bit difficult to really say how many people are actually infected with the virus.
Okay, yeah, because it does seem to be giving me that impression, because the Chinese figures seem I mean, you don't lock down a billion people for the sake of 70,000 infected and 3,000 dead. As far as my logic, my common sense tells me. So I presume you think there are a lot more infected in China than are being reported.
I suspect there are more in China than are being reported just because it's been there so much longer than the rest of the world. And I'm not quite, to be honest, I don't trust the government recordings as much. Although, if it is true that they only have 70,000 cases, that they've had 3,000 mortalities, 3,000 deaths, and that, that they were able to go control it with, their lockdown, that's actually rather impressive. I don't really know at this point how accurate the data is, just given that I don't necessarily trust the data 100%.
Yeah, my common sense is certainly telling me the same thing. But what would your opinion be on the data in Europe in comparison? Do you think that's more trustworthy?
I think to a degree, there's differences in how people test. So in Italy, for example, there's a very high mortality rate. They are having a mortality rate of 7 to 8%. But then the Italian government initially, they didn't want to test anyone unless you were truly uh, had severe symptoms, because they didn't want knowledge of the Italians having coronavirus leaking out either. So I suspect that they probably have a lot larger number than they're actually reporting as well, and that the mortality rate is simply high, partially because they're not finding everyone that has the coronavirus that has less severe disease. If you go take another reason for the high mortality is just due to the elderly population there. If you go take a look at the South Korea records, they actually show mortality rate of about like less than 1%. In some cases, I believe, and that's because they're essentially testing the whole country, including a lot of asymptomatic and younger people. So they have a lot decreased mortality because younger people seem not to be quite as affected by this virus as opposed to people over the age of about 60.
Okay, so acknowledging this and the things that I have been paying the most attention to, and I think what most people have been paying attention to, is the mass hysteria. I don't think I can say it in any other way. The mass hysteria that is sweeping the Western world. Do you think that that panic is in any way justified, or do you think that it should be managed in a more measured manner?
Um, as far as the hysteria or as far as the quarantines?
Well, specifically the hysteria of the average person. So, myself.
Yeah. I think for the average person, I'm a fairly mellow person to begin with. I would just, it's just given how easily spread this virus is, it is probably likely to go spread further. Now we have the quarantines in place for most people, specifically of your age and of my age, and people under the age of 50 or 60. I would say I wouldn't expect a high mortality rate. Depending upon your source, it's anywhere from about 0.01% to about 0.5%, or zero point 0.1 to zero point 0.5. So that would be 1 in 1,000 death or 1 in 200 death. Most people probably in our age group probably will have mild symptoms if we get symptoms. It's primarily the elderly that need to be concerned. One issue that I have is that potentially if 20% of people infected with the virus are hospitalized, I think the big issue with that is that that could put a strain on the healthcare systems of the countries that we live in. So, for example, in Italy, they're running out of ventilators for patients, and they have to turn down people for ventilators, and they just die with the virus because, we just can't treat them because there's too few resources to go around. Additionally, people who have other diseases, they might be kicked out of, they might not be hospitalized because there's other people that are being hospitalized with the virus. And third, I know I've heard rumors that from at least the media sources, and take it for what it's worth, but that China is exporting a lot fewer medications and a lot fewer masks and supplies because of the coronavirus, and so therefore we'll probably have fewer medical supplies to go around as well. I know at my hospital we're actually required to minimize our use of masks so that we can only use like one mask a day. That we need to minimize our use of other protective equipment, of scrubs, and other supplies because there's some concern that our system won't be able to go handle a larger epidemic of this virus.
Okay, so I've just received a super chat from DA. Thank you very much for the $2. And he says, all this panic for a slightly worse flu is dumb. Do you agree with this?
No, I do not. This is significantly worse than the flu. It will have a much higher mortality rate than the flu if it does spread as much as a typical flu does.
Okay, so as we've mentioned the Spanish flu, I understand that the recorded amounts of deaths when the Spanish flu had occurred was somewhere around 17 million, and it's been increased over time. I believe that the highest rankings we have now are something like 100 million or 50 million in more conservative cases. Would it be appropriate as an estimate to scale this up based on the population? Because in 1917 there were 1.5 to 2 billion people, and now there are 8 billion.
So I think it's difficult to I think it's difficult to say what the death rate is going to be, quite simply because I don't know how many people who are infected who are asymptomatic or who have a much less severe version of the disease that would bring down the death toll. Additionally, I don't know how well these quarantine measures are going to reduce the infection rate of people with the virus itself. It
Hmm.
could be that these quarantine measures are fairly successful, or that the social distancing, the 6 feet distance, the reason why we chose 6 feet is because that was the distance that we chose that was effective for the smallpox back when that was endemic. Typically for the flu, we recommend 3 feet, but 6 feet just because of it probably has an increased risk of spread. So maybe that would be helpful. Wearing a mask, to go prevent droplet spread of this virus is also potentially beneficial as well.
Okay. Right. So Kai Makota has asked, what does testing involve? How many test kits do you think they are needed, and how many do we have? How effective are current testing methods? I presume he means for the United States.
Yeah, so testing, it depends upon what you're testing for. If you're testing for PCR, that's fairly sensitive and specific, and those are good tests. They are pretty expensive, though, and we have a limited supply. I think we probably, at least in my state, only have enough tests to go test maybe about 400 people a day, which when you go consider, states have millions of people, that's not clearly going to be enough.
Hmm.
Testing, it's just a simple nasal swab. So they just either a threat swab or a nasal swab, and then they'll just go put it into a PCR, and then they will typically respond probably in about maybe about a day or two. It's pretty quick.
Okay. So, acknowledging this, how many patients do you think are actually currently walking around in the United States, given the numbers that we have? Do you think it's significantly larger by any particular factor that we could maybe extrapolate?
I think it's significantly larger than what we currently have. I know that there's certain places where they're basically not even testing for the virus, and I'm sure that it can be. I'm sure that it's prevalent, quite prevalent throughout the United States. That we're not just keep tracking. We just don't know how many people are infected, honestly, right now. As far as what factor I would multiply, it's kind of hard for me to say at the moment because each state has a different policy, and so it's again kind of difficult to say. But it's a significantly larger number than what we know.
I know in the UK they've been using over a factor of 10. So, I mean, you can't obviously give an exact number, but yeah. So, we've got a question from Jafet. There's been a lot of theories and opinions, so I'd appreciate if Doctor could tell us what the connection between coronavirus and HIV is, if there is any. I assume he's referring to the fact that the medication has been used to treat it.
Yeah. So as far as the pathology of the viruses, they're fairly different in pathology. So HIV is that's the HIV virus that is typically, or not typically, that is a retrovirus, and so it behaves differently than coronavirus, which is a positive RNA based virus. So the medications, they've tried some medications for both. It doesn't look like they're very, at least to my knowledge, that they're very effective in treating it. As far as treatments for the coronavirus currently, there's nothing that I think that would be necessarily really groundbreaking. I know that there is some, excitement about treatment with hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, based upon a couple of studies. The Chinese studies, I don't know how well run those are, but they might point that that's beneficial. There was a French study that I recently read that was recently published, maybe a couple of days ago, where they suggested the hydroxychloroquine plus azithromycin. But then I kind of have a bit of concern about that study because essentially there were significant differences between the populations of the two groups, the ones with the treatment and the ones without. It looks like the patients with the treatment were all in one hospital at Marseille in France, and all the other patients were at different hospitals throughout southern France. There was differences between the ages, and also they excluded the patients who died in the group that were treated with hydroxychloroquine and the patients that were admitted to an intensive care unit. In that study, they suggested that treatment with hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin reduced the amount of virus is produced and the spread of the virus. But then, when you're excluding the patients that die and get sent up to the ICU, it's kind of hard for me to really believe that it's a good study.
Yeah, I mean that sounds really silly. Just discounting the people who fail, like whoopsie daisy, like those, like we're just gonna discount them because they're in the wrong place. That doesn't sound especially scientific. It just sounds like someone trying to promote a particular, you know, form of treatment.
Yeah, but then the person who did the study, he's known for studying hydroxychloroquine and other infectious diseases too. It's not a typical antibiotic. It's actually used more often for autoimmune disease, and it's known for being an immunosuppressant. But this particular writer, he studied it in other different bacteria, specifically in Whipple's disease and in Q fever, which again, those are kind of rare esoteric diseases that are not very common. And so I think he was just, hey, I see this working, being studied in China. Let's go study it here and see if it works. And then he published those results.
Ah, I see. So it's just kind of like a kind of a snapshot. So in light of all of this talk of curing, what is your opinion on the production of a vaccine for this?
So coronaviruses are notoriously known for being resistant to vaccines. They actually have tried multiple times to go test immunity. So there's a study in the New England Journal in 1962 where they tested coronaviruses in people, and essentially they would infect you with a coronavirus, and then they would go infect different people at different times to see whether or not there was immunity or not, and whether or not the disease resolved. And it looks like, if first of all, it takes a long time for the antibodies to really develop. Second of all, they're not very efficacious antibodies. The maximum, the people with the maximum response to the virus, and they were testing in young healthy people, the maximum response still had a 10% reinfection rate. And then finally, it wasn't a very durable response. The immunity waned after several months, or years, and so therefore it went away. And the same thing with the SARS. Actually, patients with SARS, they don't have antibodies against SARS anymore. The immunity just simply wanes, and so I think it's very like I think that everyone tries to go find an effective vaccine, and possibly there is a mechanism, possibly out there to go develop a vaccine, but I wouldn't be optimistic about a vaccine against this virus.
Okay, so if we don't have a vaccine to fight against this with, do you think there's potential antivirals that can be developed to counter it?
I do think that there are certain treatments that we can develop to go counter this, and I think that's probably the most likely thing that we're going to go start developing. There is, I'm blanking on the name of the antiviral that they're trying in China at the moment, but I do think that that's probably what's going to be the the way forward, or what we're going to try to do to go counter this virus.
Okay, so considering okay, so we will potentially have an antiviral treatment. Do you think that it will be enough, considering the Chinese have essentially locked down their industry because of perhaps our own economic faults? We don't have all that much of a industrial base in at least Western Europe, although obviously we do have some. Do you think this will impede reaction to the virus, or perhaps make life very difficult for people living in Western countries, regardless of that? Aside from that, on things like essentials like food and toilet paper, I think's the one that's on most people's minds.
Yeah, so so on policy, it's kind of hard to say. It really depends upon, the response. I do know here in the United States that it looks like Donald Trump is enacting reforms to go essentially, you know, to perm- to permit the government to kind of invest a bit more into infrastructure and in potential, industrialization. Um, Again, I don't know how effective all these measures are going to be. They might be very effective. They might not be effective. It's just kind of hard, too early to say at this point. As far as how long, I know I was asked previously, how long is the quarantine going to remain? I honestly don't know. It kind of depends upon how quickly, the virus spreads and if we can get control of it and how effective the quarantine is.
Okay, it's just I've heard some people say that this quarantine could go on for 18 months. Now, if we have that, that sounds like it's going to absolutely stomp our economy. Do you think that that's a plausible amount of time for a quarantine to last, or do you think that they will be forced to be lifted earlier than that?
It so I think for Western countries, countries that are a bit more democratic, I think it would be difficult to maintain a quarantine for 18 months. I think that's going to be a challenge. I know China was able to go do it. They say that they rid themselves of the virus essentially by quarantining for about 2 months. If that's true, then we'll likely be in quarantine for at least 2 months. I don't know the validity of that though. As far as an earlier question about whether or not the gene for HIV resistance, the CCR5, provides any resistance to the coronavirus, Isidore is actually correct. So the coronavirus does infect through the ACE2 receptor, not through the CCR5. And so I would assume that the resistance to HIV does not provide a resistance to the coronavirus.
Okay. So, Kai Makoto has asked, is Gulf War syndrome a risk?
Gulf War syndrome. I need to Gulf War syndrome. What is that
That's the
again?
that's the thing that all of those U.S. soldiers got off of depleted uranium ammunition during the Gulf War because it wasn't
It
properly.
possibly. It's. I think most of those people are in the younger age category and probably have fewer comorbidities. So I suspect that it wouldn't be as big a risk as other different comorbidities. It appears that the high, and like this is to kind of respond to Mongoose Man as well. Um, so that looks like the things that contribute the highest risk to mortality is a history of heart disease, of high blood pressure, and of underlying other medical conditions like COPD, like cancer, like other chronic health conditions. Those appear to be the things that cause the worst symptoms of that cause, first of all, more ICU admissions and a higher mortality.
Okay, so I'll ask my own question, right? So my mum has chronic kidney failure, and I understand that she's in the risk group. She's in her mid 50s. How seriously should we be treating this?
For your mom, I would take it very seriously. She's in a high risk category,
Hmm.
especially. I don't know how advanced she is, but I would take, especially for her, I would go take it seriously. It appears that diabetics and patients with renal disease have a much higher risk of probably, so mortality, like I said, was previously about 1 to 3%. In patients with heart disease, it appears like it's upwards of 10%, and high blood pressure, diabetes, and renal disease probably around 8%.
Okay, right. So, so yeah, definitely. take care. I know that she's said that she's going to have to stay in for 4 months regardless, based on the British government advice. So thanks for that qualification. Okay. On the financial side of things, this is now a good time to get student loans with the central bank dropping the interest rates. Um, this is my own. Like, I'm no financial expert, but frankly, the amount of money that the US Federal Reserve seems to be printing and will probably keep printing, it might well cause inflation and make the student loans become effectively worthless. But maybe I'm just hoping a little bit. I've got a bit of high hopes, for some good out of this catastrophe. I don't know what you think.
As far as the financial, I wouldn't be surprised if massive inflation does occur.
Hmm.
I mean, like, granted, if you like, I don't know if there's many colleges that are going to be open, for you to go deposit your school loans or your student loans in, you know, over the summer or even next fall. I don't know exactly how it's going to go.
Hmm. Yeah, that's going to be a strange one because I'm thinking of because I'm just finishing my bachelor's degree. I'm thinking of going and doing a master's.
Yeah,
That I know that's definitely going to be impacted, but I wonder how the colleges will deal with that.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how people kind of react to this. I think
Hmm.
the people who are hardest hit are the people with small businesses.
Oh yeah, yeah. I've known of people who
Just
have already gone bankrupt through this.
Yeah, I think that's going to be an issue. I do think that some ramifications after the infection,
Hmm.
of all, given the waning immunity, I don't know how long this virus is going to stick around. There are some people hypothesizing that it could just be like the common cold and just come back every year, like the flu, which would be bad. If you have 1 to 2% of your population dying every year because of this virus, that's not a ideal situation.
No.
But but it's kind of hard to say as far as what measures will be taken in the future. I suspect that there will be much stronger laws on immigration and travel. Both immediately, both during the pandemic and if we do recover after the endemic as well. I suspect that at least in the United States, that there will be a much stronger federal government as well. And I don't know about the other countries, what they're doing, but that would be something I would be concerned about.
Well, like I can certainly see that this has effectively left economic globalization entirely bereft of any leg to stand on because of all the shortages that we are going to be experiencing very shortly, and we already are. I mean, in Britain, people are fighting over cans of food in certain parts of the country because everyone's gone and hoarded everything, and the Chinese supplier chains have been cut for 2 months nearly.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a bit ridiculous to be arguing over food right now. I think that food is going to we'll still have production of food, specifically in countries that produce quite a bit. Um, I wouldn't be arguing over cans right now. I do think that global trade will definitely decrease significantly. I One of my hopes is that so here, at least in the United States, we don't produce a lot of medications, and I'm sure the same thing is true in Great Britain.
Oh yes.
And I hope that it brings more industries back so that, should something happen, that we can actually go produce the medical equipment that we need, the other supplies that we need during the time of crisis.
Yeah, I think it will be necessary that industry is rebuilt when everyone sees what this has done. I think that the reforms, certainly of Margaret Thatcher in Britain, I don't know how far the likes of Ronald Reagan went, but this whole economic globalization and moving the industries from the industrial cities. For example, in Britain we had Birmingham, and we had Manchester to a lesser extent, Liverpool and such. In America, of course, you had Detroit and other places. I do think that that's necessarily going to have to come back over the next decade, just in light of how materially bereft we may be in the next few months. Do you think that this will happen?
Do I think that will build up our manufacturing base?
Yeah.
That's kind of that's what I would expect. It's kind of, again, very speculative, but That's what I would expect. That's what I would promote.
Okay,
So I suspect that globalism will crawl to a stop, for momentarily at least.
so do you think, as David the Distributor said, like the Tower of Babel has kind of been knocked down?
It kind of has, yes.
Okay, so Mongoose Man says, Doctor, my mum works with the NHS as a career for the sick and the elderly. Should I isolate myself from her if she has to go out and still do her work over a lockdown?
Mm, I mean, I wouldn't. So, given that your mom works with the sick and elderly, it's likely that, at least if I were running, it's hard for me because I don't work for the NHS, but if I were in charge of the NHS, I would be testing people like your mom fairly regularly and for any symptoms because she's working with the elderly and the sick. And so I would suspect that she might be, if she is being tested more frequently, that she actually might be a person who would be a bit safer to be around. If anything, what might be an issue is if you were to get sick, that you could go spread the infection to her, who could infect all those people. That might be a concern I would have.
Hmm. So, what you're saying is essentially Mongoose Man should take extra steps to stay quarantined.
Hmm.
Yeah. Are you saying yes? Or was that just like a grunt of approval?
Could you go repeat the question? I didn't quite hear it. You went out for
So
me.
you're sorry. So you're suggesting that Mongoose Man self isolate as much as possible.
I would say he, I mean, like, take reasonable precautions. I would just maintain a pretty relaxed attitude about it. Just understand that, you are going to be healthier if you do stay 6 feet away from people, if you do wear masks around people who appear to be sick. And, I wouldn't take excessive cautions around your family members because essentially I think that if your family gets sick, eventually you will get sick too. Um, you can go try to go self isolate within your home, which may be helpful. But given that the coronavirus, it appears that it actually can go stay on surfaces, particularly steel and other surfaces, for days or at least multiple hours. It's fairly likely that you will be infected at some point if a family member does. That's another reason why you should go wipe down things with antiseptics, just because the virus can go last on fomites for, I forget the specific number, but it might be as long as 72 hours.
Hmm. Okay. So, what do you think about Britain's response and other countries' responses to develop what is it, herd immunity? I think the term is. What do you think of those? Do you think they will be effective?
Um, just given that there's a reinfection risk. Um, so I don't know. Again, it might be the case that this virus, that we are, unlike other coronaviruses, are able to get a good vaccine or able to get some immunity against it. In general, I don't think, just given history of other coronaviruses, I don't think herd immunity is really going to be that effective, given the fact that you can likely be infected with the virus over time. So that kind of, lessens the role of herd immunity, to be honest.
Okay, Isadora said, if I recall correctly, virus can last outside the body for 9 days or something.
Is that this specific virus? Because different viruses have different incubation times and different periods of survivability outside, depending upon whether or not they're enveloped or non-enveloped and other factors. I'm not specifically, I don't really know off the top of my head specifically how long it lasts outside the body, but I thought I heard, and there's actually like a new article in the New England Journal where it can last. It shows different materials, and so copper, it appears like it doesn't last as long on copper as it does steel, and it doesn't last as long on cardboard as it does steel, but it appears to last a bit longer on many different objects than the old SARS virus of 2003 did.
Mm. It seems like this virus is a lot more infectious than the SARS disease, which I remember at the time was known for being really, really infectious. Is this true?
Yeah, so yeah, I would say that this new coronavirus is much more infectious
Well, I
than
mean,
the other one, or at least it appears like that.
I suppose so. I mean, we didn't have this in 2003. This, as you've said earlier on, we're comparing this to a disease from 100 years ago as the only close approximation of it, and even then, as you've said, it sort of overpowered it. Okay, so
Yeah.
Kool Aid. Hi, Em and J. It's Kool Aid. Hope you're well. Back in May 2019, a Mongolian couple died of quote bubonic plague after eating raw marmot kidney. Any connection between the coronavirus and the plague?
So I would say that there really isn't that much of a connection. So bubonic plague, it's due to a bacteria, not a virus. So due to Yersinia pestis. Typically, bubonic plague, we have fairly effective treatments for the bubonic part of bubonic plague. If you get pulmonary Yersinia pestis, I think the mortality is as high as 90 to 95%. But with the with the bubonic plague itself, um, I think that we have fairly effective treatments for that. And so we can knock it out pretty quickly, although it's still endemic in some parts of the United States, I know of.
Yeah, I remember reading about the great mortality when a very large amount of people got pneumonic plague and they just dropped dead in the streets. And I suppose like the 90 to 95%, uh, mortality rate is probably reflective of that.
So that's specifically for respiratory involvement. I would say probably for, again, for body involved, for other like lymphatic involvement, which is the more common type, or bloodstream involvement, mortality was probably around 30%. But given that, so antibiotics, as far as I'm aware of, so respiratory involvement of the bubonic plague, it's fairly rare. And I don't think that we have many good studies. And even with treatment, it appears like it has a high mortality.
Hmm. Okay, so Isidore's gone Urania pestis is a bacterium, nCoV2 is a virus. Okay, here's a trick. Mix the plausibly deniable fake information with what you put out. Use the information people you don't personally like. Don't do this. I'm not sure what you're referring to there, Isidore. Also,
Use information.
I don't know. Also, someone's warned me about using Discord and doxing by Antifa. I'm not sure why Antifa would be interested in this channel, frankly. I've moved on a bit over the years. So, yeah. So, maybe give some final thoughts. How do you think this is going to pan out? How do you think all of this is going to go? Do you think it's going to completely change society, or and how?
Yeah, I think it will change society fundamentally. Um, More because of the response to the virus. I wouldn't be surprised if we live in a much more nationalistic world, so to speak. I wouldn't be surprised if we have a lot stronger governments and if we have tighter restrictions on borders, immigration, and travel.
Hmm.
Um, that's what I suspect, at least for a bit. I also wouldn't be surprised if people, if they go through all this and then in 20 or 30 years, people forget about it and then society returns to what it has been. But then I would expect it, to be honest, to be honest, I kind of was wondering why there weren't pandemics earlier, given how much travel we've had in the past 20 years. And given the susceptibility that, just with, since everybody travels internationally, or many people do at least, you would think that we would be at higher risk for more endemic diseases. I'm kind of surprised that it took until this long, honestly, to really have a pandemic disease that we're concerned about.
Hmm. Do you think there's a possibility of a religious revival in light of all of this?
Um, it depends. I think it depends upon how people act. It's difficult with. I know that in stressful situations, people generally tend to like go towards religion, but currently, with all the churches shutting down, with all the major groups shutting down, I don't know if it's going to be like a true religious revival or if people will just become more spiritual or what have you.
Hmm. It's just I figure
I think,
if you've got all of these
yeah,
people stuck at home because they're not going to be able to stare at the screens forever.
yeah.
Surely. I mean, I've been confounded
Well,
before, but you know.
yeah, and it also depends upon like how religious people act and the like.
Hmm. Okay, so has anyone got any final questions in the chat? Let's see. Oh yeah, I'm well aware that Antifa probably already knows where I live. Like I've dealt with them before, and I've gone. You know, if you want to come to my house, I'll buy you a beer. Right. Oh, you're talking to Louis the
Yeah.
14th.
Well, also, the commies nationalized food production in China. They also used Lysenkoism, which caused significant famine in China too, because they didn't understand that plants apparently are not communist, and that by spreading the weeds amongst the corn, you typically don't get better results than just the corn alone, because the weeds don't help the corn.
Yeah, it's funny that how there's no proletariat and solidarity between different seeds.
The solidarity of plants typically doesn't work out too well.
People believed this.
Well, there are many strange beliefs throughout the world.
Yeah, yeah, there certainly are, and I don't think anyone here is lacks any of these.
So that's a question. So I think we haven't discussed like what happens to patients while in the hospital with the virus.
Oh, okay.
Um, so patients who go to the hospital, they get this syndrome called ARDS, which stands for acute respiratory distress syndrome. It can actually be caused by multiple different causes, such as this is actually the number one cause of why people who drowned die, because they're typically rescued and brought to the hospital, but then they suffer from ARDS, and that's the significant cause of mortality. Viral pneumonias also cause that as well. But essentially, what happens is that the lungs they get biological cells and a lot of proteins and a lot of everything shoved into the alveoli of the lungs, and you can't exchange air very well. After that, what happens is that people suffer from essentially all the organ systems shut down, and you suffer from multi-system organ failure. And then some group of people get sepsis, and so that's essentially what people believe is the cause of mortality. To go answer Mongoose's question, there are some cases where people suspect that the virus does attack the heart in some way or does cause ventricular arrhythmias. I haven't seen that too much in the studies. It seems to be more prevalent in the Chinese data as opposed to the European data. In the Chinese data, they suggest that about 16% of people hospitalized get an arrhythmia of some sort. I don't know if that's a ventricular or an atrial arrhythmia, but there are cases supposedly where it is associated with heart disease. I don't know if that's actually because the virus is infecting the heart or there's an immunological reaction. There was a case report where they took an autopsy of a patient who died of the virus, and they did show inflammation of the heart and of the liver, of
Mm.
course. But then, of course, the patient was also treated with this medication called interferon alpha that ramps up the immune system in the hopes that they're. So I don't know if their death was actually due to the virus or if it was due to, the findings are due to the treatment.
Mm. Okay, sorry, I don't know if you cut off there at the end because I did you stop talking because you've been a bit jumpy. I guess he is dropping out a little bit.
I was talking. Did I cut out? I was
Yeah,
talking
you
about
yeah you cut
like the
out.
cause of death of the disease.
Yeah, you cut out.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Did I say everything that did it seem to make?
Well, yeah, you're dropping out. I'll tell you what, I'll switch the server on Discord across, and hopefully that will improve the connection. We'll switch to the US Central. Okay,
Yeah.
hello. Do you hear? Say something.
Hello. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. There we go. Sorted.
Yes, I can.
You're still dropping out, man.
Okay. So I guess. Oh, I'm still dropping out. even
Nah,
now.
nah, you're coming through clear for 95% of what you're saying, and then you're just sort of cutting off at the end. I don't know if it's because you're using
Okay.
push to talk or if it's the voice activity playing up.
Oh, I'm using push to talk, so maybe that's the reason why.
Ah, yeah, yeah. You had a little bit towards the
So
end there, but yeah, it's probably that. Okay, what do you recommend we
yeah.
do in order to prevent ourselves from getting infected or infecting others?
Just follow like the standard advice. Stay 6 feet away from people and wear a mask if you need to, in places where you're likely to be exposed.
Hmm. Also, a question that's been leveled at me
What
about
is
something unrelated. I'll just quickly answer this, and you can get back about
yeah.
Antifa doxing you and destroying your lives. It's like I'm always worried about being doxed by Antifa and my life destroyed. It's like a somewhat sort of Damocles hanging over my head. Well, you can't live your life in fear. As far as I understand, George Washington, you don't do anything on YouTube, so you have no reason to worry. And even if you are doxed by Antifa, uh, you know, as I said, pursue the kingdom of God, and all else will follow. If you're persecuted by them, then so what? If it impacts, you've got to be aware of who it impacts. But if it's only just you, there's no reason to fear these people. What can they do? Physically harm you? I mean, you're not that much of a pain, first of all. And second of all, if they do, they do. That's another crown, okay? So you were saying, Johannes?
So there's just like a bunch of like questions in the chat, like why hasn't Africa been hit as hard? There are some theories that people don't travel there as much. Coronaviruses in general, at least the common cold, they typically are the most common in the winter. So, but I suspect, given that there are infections in South America and Australia, where it is the summer currently, I suspect that's not really the case. Africa, I think in general, they just don't have the testing capacity. And so they just probably have a lot more cases that they're just not testing.
Yeah, I very much suspect that as well, especially since they found cases in Egypt and Nigeria, and those places have a very, very high population. Very cramped together as well.
That they have a very dense population. Yeah.
Yeah, in Lagos
Yeah.
and
I mean, like
Cairo.
they're just not testing most people.
Hmm. Anyway, we've gone on for about 55 minutes. Okay, pursuing the kingdom of God didn't keep Taunton Moore's head attached to his body. Just saying. Yeah, it didn't. And he's a saint. Okay, so I think that's actual final thoughts this
Yeah.
time.
So there's so I would say in general, I wouldn't freak out about just take every day one day at a time. Protect yourself if you can, and just know what happens. You know, the world's going to go on, and the question is, okay, what do we do in our daily lives to kind of adjust to it? And that's, our lives are just going to be changed fundamentally for the next several months, if not years, and just recognize that that's going to happen and be adaptive.
Yeah. If any of you guys want some quick reading, it might be beneficial to go and read the Book of Ecclesiastes. Because, it says in that book, there's a time for celebration, there's a time for tears. And it just happens we're in a time for tears. So, Bella's got another question. I mean, you can ask us through DMs if you want, Belle. We've been going for nearly an hour. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this. And thanks for the super chats, by the way, DA. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.